How to learn new languages in stacks. So why do we care about this topic? This is why I said we're not going to teach you Ruby or Rails or anything else. You're going to learn those things, but not because we're going to present that material. We're going to present a way to think about absorbing a new language or a new framework. And I really have to say a new framework because I think today frameworks drive the adoption of languages. Most people don't want to learn JavaScript. They want to learn how to write cool apps with React. Most people don't want to learn Ruby, but they've heard that Rails is a pretty good framework for writing the server side of those apps. So a lot of the times, the learning of a language and all of the baggage that comes with it really is because you want to use the language with a particular problem. Now, the bad news is if you sort of look at the history of software, even in software as a service, is littered with frameworks. The venerable CGI bin from 1990 through PHP, Java server pages, ASP.NET, and today an unholy proliferation of JavaScript-oriented front-end frameworks. The good news for you is that all of those frameworks are based on imperative, object-oriented languages, languages in which you specify step-by-step what to do, and in which you do data hiding by declaring classes, methods that operate on instances of those classes, and ways to connect them together. From that point of view, all of those languages are far more alike than they are different. And what makes a valuable developer when you're out there trying to get hired is not which stacks you know, it's how fast you can learn a new one and start being productive in it. So we have come up with a 3-stage plan for learning a new language in Stack. The first step is, well, you have to learn the language. But there's a systematic way that you can do this. There's a series of questions you can ask that will allow you to relate concepts in the new language to maybe something you already know from a language you're familiar with. That's why I had to start by assuming that you're comfortable in at least one imperative object-oriented language. It gives you a baseline. Once you've learned the language, and I'll tell you our 8-step plan for learning the language, the next thing is to understand what is the application architecture your framework supports. To say that you are learning React is to say that you are learning an essentially data flow-based view of the world in which data percolates from the root of the tree down to the branches and changes are automatically handled for you. To say that you are learning Rails as a server framework means you are understanding that apps can be thought of as structured model view controller, that those are entities that have a particular role and they influence how you organize the app, and the framework is there to support that kind of architecture. So understanding what the framework wants you to do, right? Because what you'll find is if the type of app you're writing is structurally poorly matched to your framework, you're going to be in a world of pain. Because most frameworks make it really easy to follow the structure they have and really painful if you don't. And finally, having understood the language and the architecture, all you have left to do is to understand the mapping between the two. And what that means is, what are the things in the language that allow the framework to provide the abstractions that it provides? Right? So if you can do these 3 things, if you break down your task of learning a new language and framework into these 3 steps, we believe that you'll develop a general scheme for becoming rapidly productive. So what does that look like? We have an 8-step plan for learning the language. And this is where I'm going to invite you to go read the draft chapter of the brand new, not even yet published 2nd edition book. It's linked from the syllabus. But the 8-step plan is as follows. First of all, how does the language deal with types and typing? Do types matter? How do you specify them? What are the primitive things you can do? How do you do basic stuff like conditionals, loops, transfer of control, things like that? How do you define functions? Functions are a basic building block in any imperative object-oriented language. So how do you deal with things like parameters, things like return values? How does scope work inside of a function? Abstraction and encapsulation. How can you hide data? How can you group together items of data and operations you can do on those data? And in most languages that we would look at in a course like this, it will have to do with how those languages let you talk about objects and maybe about classes, and do they support things like inheritance? So what are the methods of hiding data from the view of entities that don't need it, and how do those things get done in the language that you're trying to learn? What are the idioms of the language? We'll come back to this because this is really important, but this is the one thing about learning a new language that is usually the biggest stumbling block. There are ways of doing things in that language that don't look exactly like a way of doing it in a language that you already know. And sometimes learning those idioms can be really hard. I mean, for me, it's like when I first had to learn pointers. It took me like a month to understand pointers because I had never dealt with a language that pointers were a thing. So There's a certain amount of banging your head against the wall to get this, but it's really important, in part because really good frameworks will take advantage of the language idioms to make the framework easier to use. The framework assumes you know how to use the idioms well, and it will give you a way to leverage that to your advantage. Libraries. Most languages are easier to learn than the libraries that support them. So how do you do libraries? How do you manage dependencies when your app depends on a lot of different libraries? Are there tools available to help you do that, like pip for Python, or like bundler for Ruby, or like npm if you're programming in JavaScript, heaven help you? How do you do debugging? Does the language have an interactive debugger where you can get in and poke around? Can you print the values of things? Can you have the debugger trigger when a variable changes its value or when some other condition happens? And how do you test stuff? What testing framework allows you to sort of cross-check what you're doing by always being able to write little tests that act as sanity checks against your code? That is our 8-step plan for learning the language, and it is not without a few pitfalls. In particular, there's a quote, and I don't know who it's attributed to, that says, you can write Fortran in any language. Here's what that quote means. What is this? It's a hot dog. Do we have any German speakers in the room? Any German speakers at all? No. OK, well, I'll still make this work. If you were a German speaker and you translated each of those two words, heiße is hot, Hund is dog. And yet, heiße Hund doesn't mean hot dog. It actually means a dog in heat. So if you go to a street vendor and ask for that, you will get the wrong thing because you have not learned the idioms of the language. Hot dog is an idiom in English. So there are going to be weird idioms in Ruby and JavaScript and other languages. And understanding how those idioms change a little bit the way that you approach the language is one of the key ways that you become a person who thinks in Ruby or thinks in JavaScript. Lastly, as a debugging tip about blindly copy-pasting, the MIT AI Lab, one of the very earliest hotbeds of really interesting computing hardware and software, developed this sort of legend about the koans, Zen puzzles. One of the koans goes that Marvin Minsky, one of the sort of fathers of symbolic AI, came into the AI lab one day, and there was a novice, probably a PhD student, who was repeatedly rebooting a machine. And Marvin Minsky said, why do you repeatedly reboot the machine? And the student said, it's not working properly, and I thought by rebooting it, I could get it to do the right thing. And Minsky says, you cannot simply reboot a machine with no understanding of what's going wrong and then expect that to fix the problem. Minsky then rebooted the machine, and the machine worked. I leave you to derive from that what you will, but don't copy-paste code if you don't know where it's been. Okay? Last slide. Advice. We're going to help you learn from the internet. The internet is awesome. I could never have learned Ruby or any other language without Stack Overflow. But Google it first, all right? Find the nouns and verbs of the sentence. If you're asking your buddy, hey, how do you get the keys out of a hash in Ruby? Well, if you type in just the nouns and verbs, you'll probably get pointers to the top 3 or 4 Stack Overflow questions. It is not unusual to spend way more time looking up stuff and finding good examples of how to do it as the amount of time you spend actually writing code. Don't be surprised if you say, oh my gosh, I've been programming for like an hour and I wrote like 6 lines. If those 6 lines are well informed, because you spent the rest of that hour actually researching what are the different ways to do this so you could find a good way, that time will be repaid over and over. Does the answer have a lot of upvotes? Is it from a reputable site like Stack Overflow? Probably a better answer. You could even read the real documentation. Once you've seen a few examples, take a look at what's possible in detail, read the actual library docs. And finally, don't copy-paste code you don't understand. To see if you understand it, try to insert a bug in it. After it works and you think it's doing what you like, change something about it and see if you understand the effect. We'll have much more tips about this, but start learning Ruby because we're going to do some Ruby fun things on Thursday. Thank you for your attention. See you in a couple of days.